Let's talk about roasting a washed red Bourbon from Burundi. If you're new here, my name is James and I run a coffee roasting company called The Blending Room based in Hull, East Yorkshire in the United Kingdom. On a weekly basis, I release a brand new coffee to our customer base and I use YouTube as a medium in which to describe how I have roasted that coffee. This particular example is Masenga Hill. It was brought to us here at the Blending Room by Omwani Coffee Importers based in York, North Yorkshire, which isn't too far away from the roastery, and I like that. I've been working with Omwani for 3 seasons now, and this is the 3rd, maybe even the 4th, I'd have to check my notes, season that I have purchased Masenga Hill amongst others from the groups of growers that Omwani work with in Burundi. I love roasting coffees from this part of the world because I enjoy brewing coffees from this part of the world. They display lots of acidity and lovely brown sugar, sticky sweet notes as well. They also particularly lend into filtration-based brew methods, which is my preferred method of brewing. So this video should hopefully describe the passion that I have from this particular part of the world and the coffees that are grown there. So, roasting a washed red Bourbon from this part of the world, Burundi specifically, because you can get Bourbons all over the place, but you get a lot of them in this part of Northeast Africa. First of all, when I'm designing a roast profile, I think about what I want that coffee to be, how I want to express that coffee. Maybe even I'm thinking about what type of method of brewing that I want to display that coffee in. And I will design a roast profile that is proportionate to the things that I really enjoy. So I like clarity, I like acidity, I like texture and sweetness, but they all have to support in this lovely arcing flavor of balance. I love balance in a cup. So during the development of a roast profile, those are the thoughts that I'm putting forward into my head. For cleanliness, I may decide to have a quicker roast with a shorter development time than something that I want to express more texture of. I may also choose a lower end temperature to accentuate some of the fruit characteristics within the cup. And I might also choose a lighter coloration to end the roast at, proportionate to the style of brew method that I want, in this case a filtration brew method. Now this isn't describing exactly what to do with a red Bourbon. Moreover, before you get roasting, have an idea of the expression of the coffee that you want in order to build out the plan to execute that expression. Once you've got a plan for executing the expression of the coffee, you should also have a method of preparing your roasting apparatus ready for that particular batch. I use a fixed batch size for all of the roasting. I roast on the Loring S15 Falcon. It is a nominal load mass of 15 kilos, but I choose 12. Why? Because I feel like I get the best of both worlds of volume output, but flexibility so that I can push and shove and manipulate the roast profiles as I choose, and not somewhat restricted by the mass of beans that are inside the roasting drum. That being said, it doesn't mean that you can't run at 100% capacity. I've just not learnt how to do it adequately yet. I say yet because Rob Stein, he's encouraging me to go and take a course, which I will do at some point, but I've got another new child in my family and trying to get time away from the business and the family is becoming increasingly difficult. Further to deciding your load, you must also have your machine prepared thermally as well. So if it's the first batch, make sure you go through your standardized warm-up cycle, and or if it's a batch that you are producing inside of your roast production day, choose an adequate time for the coffee to go into your roasting drum proportionate to the amount of thermal mass that you have in said drum. And what do I mean by that? I like to start my roasting day with soft coffee, so I will start with a decaf. There's less energy stored in all of that metal, and therefore, without having all of that thermal energy available, you compensate with a softer bean, a bean that doesn't need quite so much pushing and shoving by energy. So I would start with a decaf, I'd then go with low altitude coffee, say from Brazil, and I would end up with the darker roast that I may do. And inside of there, this high altitude washed red Bourbon would feature somewhere towards the end of the roasting day when there's lots of energy available in order to manipulate the roast as I wish. So how about now, I open my laptop and we describe the actual profile itself. On the screen, you will see the roast profile for this coffee here, Morambi Hill, the release that I have put out for our coffee subscribers this week at Blending Room. You will note that there is an ever declining rate of rise curve. There is a little bit of a crash. It's not a heavy crash, it is somewhat controlled, but it is indicative of this particular part of the world. You do get quite a lot of thermal release and it can be a little bit difficult to manage. That being said, I know that the coffee tastes good and therefore I'm happy with this at this point in time. You will see that I have used what we would describe as a pyramid heat approach. That is, where you use a smaller amount of gas in the early part of the phase, you would taper up to peak energy, and at some point throughout the roast profile, you would then begin to taper away to allow yourself to come to a stop point that is soft and controlled. In this instance, the roast length was 9 minutes and 29 seconds. The development time was 1 minute and 21 seconds, which is 14.2% as a development time ratio. The end temperature was 210.3 degrees Celsius. Importantly with this coffee, first crack was 8 minutes and 8 seconds. I tend to find that Bourbons need a little more time inside of the roasting drum to first crack in order to develop balance within the cup. I tend to like first crack to happen between 8 and 8.5 minutes, dependent on the coffee. And of course, when I'm first roasting a new red Bourbon from a new country, I would need to feel around to figure out how energy is absorbed by the bean throughout time. But in this case, it was 8 minutes and 8 seconds until I marked first crack, which on the lowering, I mark at 202 degrees Celsius. Let's go back to the development time. This is the time between when we mark first crack being a thermal energy event where water is expelled from the coffee beans and the coffee becomes a roasted product, before which you would just have grainy, grassy characteristics and you probably wouldn't be able to brew it particularly well, if at all. First crack is a very important mark point within the roast cycle, and it's a key communicating factor between roasters about their particular profile. The development time, so the period after this, is also another very important communication tool for roasters to describe how we've got to our end point or reached our end design. 1 minute and 21 seconds is, I would describe as a relatively short first crack development period, and I wanted to do this in order to try and maintain as much of the poppy, vibrant acidity that you get from coffees in this part of the world. If you extend the development time, you're very likely to reduce acidity and reduce the clarity of fruit characters within the cup. The trick is to modulate your development time proportionate to your brew method, proportionate to the processing method of the particular coffee, and also how you want to modulate those flavors within the cup in degrees of balance. Nominally, shorter development times have more fruits and acidity, longer development times have more caramelization and a lower degree of acidity, and maybe an increase in texture too. A short development time for me is 1 minute and 15 to 1 minute and 30. For me, a medium amount of development time is 1 minute 30 to say 1 minute and 3/4. And then if I was going to be doing a darker roast or something that was specifically for espresso, maybe 1 minute and 3/4 up to 2.25 minutes of that balancing time. Let's not call it development time. how about describing it as balancing time? That's a good way of using language to describe what roasters are trying to do, balancing their coffee to their desired endpoint. Red Bourbons from Burundi are also very vibrant in character. So I chose a lower end temperature than I may usually do for other types of coffees. For example, if I was roasting a coffee from Brazil, where they're very texture led, I may choose a higher end temperature. So on this particular roasting apparatus, somewhere between 213 and 216 degrees Celsius maybe. Through that higher temperature, you would get more texture, less fruit characteristics, of which in a Brazil coffee, there tends to be a little less anyway, driven by cultivar selection and altitude. So for this washed red Bourbon, because of its wonderful characteristics as a cultivar and also the geography in which it was grown, choosing a lower end temperature accentuates the available fruit characteristics that this geography and cultivar give you. Going back to the profile and the heat approach, I like to use Loring's 20-ish seconds of soaking before I then begin to taper up the energy. And in which case, I'm imagining the coffee beans absorbing the latent energy within inside of the drum to the point where they begin to equilibrate. At that point, I start really beginning to push up the energy through to peak energy. At this point was about 3 minutes or so into the roast cycle. Peak energy in terms of this Loring was 96% of the total gas available, and I would push this until I would see the beans begin to become not exothermic, because they don't get exothermic, but you'll see that the rate of rise decline begins to flatten at some point. So the beans begin to almost get to a state of equilibrium based on heat expulsion and heat absorption. It's at this point that I choose to taper away, because I want to bring the coffee now to a polite endpoint. I want to arrive at my temperature and time under control. If I kept huge amounts of energy going in, you'll find that thermally the beans will just not accept heat particularly well. You may see temperatures race away dependent on cultivar and processing, and that's not my style. I like to arrive at my stop point under control, and I regularly use the analogy of coming to a stop point in a motor vehicle. You would not drive at 60 miles an hour and press on the brake at a stop point. What you would tend to do, or be taught to do, is to gradually press down on your brake pedal so that you come to a soft close. That's how I like to roast. I may get asked about fan speed. I actually cannot control anything to do with airflow or fan speed inside of the Loring. The burner and fan are intrinsically linked and outside of my control. If I was roasting on a Probat or another drum roaster with airflow control, I would be using less air in the early parts of the roast so that there's a huge amount of conductive heat transfer, and towards the latter part of the roast I would increase my airflow to, one, expel some of the roast smoke and gases that are produced, the chaff that's produced, and also to try and promote more convective heat transfer as well. Also, introducing an additional amount of airflow will, on a drum roaster, be bringing in cooler air, and it will assist you in tapering down to a stop point. Be mindful not to put too much airflow in, because you can have negative connotations in cut profile because of that. But if I was on a drum roaster, low air at the beginning, more air at the end, I didn't actually have airflow control on that. That just had a fixed damper, one type of airflow throughout the whole roast cycle. Okay, so I've described a little bit about how I would imagine my roast to be based on how I was going to brew it, and then the values of which this particular roast were in its execution. So how about tasting the coffee as well? Now, I want acidity, fruit characteristics, some sweetness, but it to be balanced. So let's dig in and have a taste. it's exactly what I get. There's lots of green apple, some malic acidity. There's a touch of smidge of blood orange in there too. So tick in the box as far as acidity goes. Transparency, so that low end temperature also promotes the transparent fruit characteristics. The short development time, that again has boosted the transparency or the clean cup profile. And also that 8 minutes and 8 seconds to first crack gives some degree of balance within the cup as well. The thing that's allowed us to get the texture, in this case, a brown sugar, muscovado sugar, was the 9.5 minute total roast time. This is an extremely light roast. I've done a roast weight loss of 12%. I tend to find that I get a lot of success in that roast weight loss metric, and it's something that I encourage you to actually play around with. For light roasts, do something between 11 and 13% weight loss. For medium roasts, somewhere between 13 and 15% weight loss, and keep those extending depending on the end colors. Overall, I'm really happy with this particular cup of coffee. I'm happy with the roast profile. If I was to critique it, maybe I would push the roast for another 15 seconds, so take the 8 minutes and 8 first crack, push that to 8 minutes and 30 maybe. I think you might get a touch more solubility. Maybe because of that, keeping the 1 minute and 20-ish seconds of development time. I like the clarity, and putting those two things together, I might beef out some of the muscovado sugar, because that's a fantastic characteristic of this particular coffee. However, overall, this is very, very tasty. And that's a nice way of closing. I hope this has been an insightful video about how you would construct a profile, how I roasted a particular Red Bourbon from Burundi. If you have any comment or critique, do let me know in the comment section below. That's what it's here for, to create a community, as YouTube would say. I'm interested to hear from other roasters about how they would roast this particular cultivar. If any of you out there happen to pick up a bag of this, which is neatly available online or with me at Beverley Market, and if you're a coffee subscriber of us, you get this £12 bag for a tenner through your letterbox. What a stunning deal that is. I digress. It would be useful, if you do brew this, to let me know whether this profile hits the things that you would expect from my description of how I've built it. Brewing coffee is incredibly, well, interesting, and you have to traverse so many problems. So it would be useful for me as a roaster to understand how you get along with this coffee. And until that point, you have a fab week ahead. Cheers.